Hello everyone and welcome back to another session of Elden Ring PvP and another weapon showcase. Today we're taking a look at the Bloody Helice. This is a weapon that is named incorrectly. It should be the Bloody Helix because Helice is plural of helix, but I digress. Let's get started with the basics. This weapon is one that you get in the Rye the Blood Ruins. After you beat the boss, there is a chest with this weapon inside. The weapon requires 16 strength, 19 dexterity, and 17 arcane in order to wield, and it weighs a total of 8 units. The skill on the weapon is Dynast's Finesse, and you are unable to change that because it is a somber weapon. At plus 10, it has a physical base damage of 296, an E scaling in strength, a C scaling in dexterity, and a B scaling in arcane. Overall, this weapon is phenomenal. If you invest the stats into this thing, it is just a great weapon. The damage on it is great, and it's a heavy thrusting sword, so it's got all of these standard heavy thrusting sword pros. They're a very powerful class of weapon, and this one is no exception. The biggest pro of this weapon class is, of course, the moveset. They are phenomenal at chasing people down. The running R2s, as we all know by this point, are extremely common. They cover an insane amount of distance, and they deal a good amount of damage. Of course, all attacks on this weapon are thrusting attacks, so they will all benefit from the Spear Talisman. On top of that, though, this weapon does, of course, have bleed damage. It deals 55 bleed per hit as a baseline. If you invest more arcane into it, of course, it will deal much, much more. So you'll bleed opponents extremely easily with this weapon. Of course, with the heavy thrusting swords, you have the benefit of a couple of combos as well. Your two-handed jumping R2 into R1 combo, as well as your jumping R1 into R1 combo, are kind of the bread and butter of the weapon. They work phenomenally well. But the big thing that makes this one unique is the skill. Dynast's Finesse is phenomenal. It has the same number of iframes as Bloodhound's Step on the initial part of the skill, where you do that fancy backstep thing. And if you are playing Unlocked, you can aim the direction that you're going with that backstep, as well as the direction that you're going with the follow-up attack. So if you play it well, you can actually unlock, face away from your opponent, use the initial part of the attack towards them, target lock them, and cover the rest of that remaining distance with the forward stab. A lot of people don't expect it, a lot of people don't realize that it can be unlocked and you can do that, and that's a great thing. Aside from that, though, there actually is a follow-up to it that almost no one ever uses, because, to be perfectly honest, it's not super useful. Even if you are playing Unlocked and go for that follow-up, you can't really aim it very well. You can turn somewhat slightly with it, but typically no more than, I'd say, probably like 30 degrees in any direction. So it ends up not being extremely useful, because most people, when they dodge, will dodge more than a 30-degree angle behind you. So if it were able to be free-aimed a little bit more on that follow-up, it would be a more useful attack, but unfortunately it cannot be. So that's a bit of a downside with the weapon. It's got a bit of a forgettable attack. Not a huge deal, to be honest. And to be fair, it's a bit nitpicky to call that a downside. It's not like it's a huge detriment to the weapon to have an attack that's not especially useful. Especially given, how many other attacks on this weapon are extremely good. So, it is what it is. That all said, other pros of the weapon, I mentioned that it does, of course, work with the Spear Talisman. I mentioned that the damage overall is great. I mentioned that Dynast's Finesse has a great utility in its backstep, being the same number of iframes as Bloodhound's Step. So really, that's about all that there is for the weapon. It's pretty straightforward, because it is a thrusting sword, and they generally are pretty straightforward. Like I said, though, cons of the weapon, I guess the fact that you do have that follow-up attack to Dynast's Finesse not being overly spectacular, but aside from that, the running R1 attacks on the weapon, they're just fine. Realistically, you're going to use the running R2s more often than not, so that more than makes up for it, in my opinion. And then aside from that, if you really want the weapon to shine, you really do need a good amount of investment in dexterity and arcane. so it does require a bit of a heavy stat investment to really be at its peak. It's better at the 150 meta as opposed to the 120 meta because of that, but that's really not that big of a deal in my opinion. It's just something to keep in mind. That said, all the fights in this video were at 150, which I am starting to think I might enjoy a bit more. I feel like we see a bit more variety at that level compared to the 120 meta. With the 120 meta, it's a lot of builds that are either strength builds or dex builds. It's one or the other. And in comparison to the 150 builds, I feel like we see more variety in weapons, I feel like we see more variety in build types, but that's just my opinion on it. I feel like there's a time and place for each, but let me know what you guys think in that regard. Mild tangent aside, overall, it's a super great weapon, super fun to use, super powerful if you're spec'd properly for it, and overall, I think it's just a good weapon. Heavy thrusting swords are going to be extremely powerful, just because the class itself is extremely powerful. We've seen it before with the Great Ape and the Dragon King's Cragblade, and I'm sure we'll see it with the Stitcher as well, but either way, there's one fight left after this one. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, found it helpful in one way or another. If you have, then do all the YouTube things. Please do like, subscribe, leave a comment, and that's all I've got. So again, thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you all next time.